So, the topic that I decided to explore for my learning and memory final project was sex on the brain. So, the question that I started out by asking was, how does sex control our minds? But I came to find that there was so much information on this, so many different areas and ways that, sex is controlled to our health, our neurochemistry. So, I decided to kind of narrow it down a little bit and came to the claim that our sexual behaviors and their outcomes are reflected in our individual cognitive makeup. So, in essence, our personalities can be explained by the way that our brains are constructed, and as a result, our sexual behavior can be explained by the same thing. So, there are two main reasons that people have sex. The primary reason from an evolutionary standpoint is mating, so reproduction. That is how we procreate our species, but nowadays it seems the primary reason is pleasure. So, that is driven by want and desire with a bunch of systems, the dopamine system, the curiosity system, and other things that we've explored. So, in order to achieve sex, we need arousal, desire, and opportunity. So, that means that we need to interpret the stimuli around us and understand if we're getting positive feedback from people we're trying to have sex with. We need to respond to hormonal and neurochemical changes, meaning that we need to understand our body's reactions. We need to read the signs from our sympathetic nervous system. If our heart rate is speeding up, if we're understanding that our bodies are ready for sex, craving sex, we need to make sense of external cues, and we need to learn from our experience by figuring out kind of what works and what doesn't, what behaviors will result in the outcome that we're looking for. And as a result of this, we end up associating stimuli that we think have to do with sex with the sexual outcome. So those stimuli, as a result, begin to remind us of sex, make us think of sex, and give us the signs that sex is going to happen. So everybody has different preferences, as we know. No two people have the same taste, and this is based on what we're seeking. Different people have different levels of importance for different traits that they're looking for in a partner. So when we're looking for somebody to have children with, we look for factors such as good genetic health, good genetic material, wealth, higher social status, good potential parental investment, or we could have sex with somebody just because we're simply aroused by them. There are characteristics that they hold that we find desirable and attractive. There are many areas of our brain that are involved in sex because sex ties into so many different aspects of our life. So sex has a lot to do with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is interestingly twice as large in men as it is in women, and it releases oxytocin and vasopressin, which are two hormones that I will be explaining later. The brainstem is seen as the origin of the arousal system. It releases a bunch of chemicals which speed up the flow of information between nerve cells and basically tell our bodies that we're going to be having sex. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, which controls instinct, emotion, and social processing. So it can trigger things like penile erection, sexual feelings, sensations of pleasure, memories of sexual intercourse, and orgasm, among other things. The prefrontal cortex is important for initiation of sexual behavior because it is responsible for inhibiting appropriate behavior. So as you can imagine, sex, you need to be behaving properly in order to get your desired outcome. The lateral septum regulates sexual behavior and releases AVP, which is arginine vasopressin, which I will explain later. The ventral pallidum has receptors for both oxytocin and vasopressin, and so does the nucleus accumbens, which both play a large role in the reward system. And the ventral tegmental area contains neurons that release dopamine. So neurotransmitters that are released having to do with attachment are oxytocin and vasopressin. They're sibling molecules, and they both help to promote monogamy in that they allow humans to feel attachment. Oxytocin is released during vaginal stimulation as well as during childbirth, so that explains the connection that mothers feel towards their children. Vasopressin is a hormone molecule that affects things such as blood pressure, stress regulation, and social behavior. And depending on what particular receptor it is binding to, its effects will vary. It's released during social interaction and mating. There are high levels of vasopressin released in the ventral pallidum, specifically AVP. And when vasopressin binds to AVPR1 receptors, people experience a neurological reward. So they become more likely to repeat the behavior that they were carrying out. In this case, it would be sex. So oxytocin increases attachment in pair bonding and mother-infant bonding, and more oxytocin in the brain has a correlation to more stimulation in sexual activity. Essentially, we're wired to want sex for the survival of our species, and the same brain regions that deal with these hormones that I'm explaining and dopamine are the same brain regions and neural circuits that work with drug addiction. So this is what makes us continue to want to repeat our behaviors. So two examples of monogamy versus polygamy are prairie voles and meadow voles. They're two types of rodents with very similar cognitive makeup, and scientists have looked at their brains in order to understand why people behave either in a pair bonding manner or in a promiscuous manner. So prairie voles are very monogamous. They have the same mate for life. If their mate dies, they're very unlikely to seek out a new mate. And not surprisingly, they have more oxytocin and AVP receptors in their brains. So they're more likely to become attached. They can become attached to a mate just by living with them. Sex doesn't even have to be part of the picture. And meadow voles are very polygamous and promiscuous. They're unlikely to take a mate for life, although scientists have been able to inject oxytocin and AVP into the brains of meadow voles and found that it made them act monogamously. And if you block the oxytocin receptors in the prefrontal cortex or AVP receptors in the lateral septum of prairie voles, they are likely to do the opposite. They are going to become very polygamous. So here is a diagram. You can see that the vasopressin receptors in the prairie vole are in a very different spot than in the montane vole or meadow vole. And as you can see, the oxytocin receptors in the prairie vole are very, very concentrated, whereas it's very hard to see them in the montane vole. So here is the same information as right here. And CSF was used as sort of a control here for this graph. And the prairie voles have exceedingly higher levels of AVP than the montane voles. So that's just to give you a sense of what's going on with their brain chemicals. So there's similar behavior in humans. There is an AVPR1A genotype. So there's a specific allele of this AVP receptor that when found in males, they end up having problems with pair bonding. This is because this particular allele has trouble with expressing the receptor, and therefore it will bind less frequently. And as a result, these men will not feel the positive reinforcement of the AVP and will be less likely to feel attachment and stay monogamous. So men that had 2 copies of this allele were significantly less likely to be married than men with 0 copies, and they were much more likely to be facing threat of divorce or relationship crisis. Here's a graph that explains the same data. So during orgasm, there's a lot of different brain activity going on in males and females. As I mentioned, with the males having a hypothalamus twice as large as females, the sexual brain looks very different between the genders. So in men during orgasm, they have reduced activity in the amygdala. So this can explain relaxation of vigilance. They're letting their guard down. Women have reduced activity in the frontal lobe. They're reducing their inhibition. They're letting themselves feel at ease. They're feeling very comfortable. And both have increased activity in the cerebellum, which is implicated in emotional arousal. So not surprisingly, both of the genders are very aroused during orgasm. So our personalities actually play a large part in our sexual behavior. So our social dispositions kind of predict how we're going to act in a sexual manner. We process stimulation differently. So somebody who's very extroverted doesn't need as much of stimulation to feel very aroused sexually, whereas somebody who's more introverted might require more stimulation because they're less likely to, get the same reaction from the same stimulation due to kind of a high level of they're very guarded in their emotions and such. So sometimes they might need violence or, different kinds of sex play in order to reach the same levels of arousal. There are actually very, very many cognitive benefits that come from sexual arousal, that come from sex. So sex leads to cell growth in the hippocampus. It interrupts the process of forgetting and improves our memory. Oxytocin, additionally, has been found to be a pain reliever. It can help reduce headaches and alleviate stress. And as we know, dopamine makes us happy. There were several studies that found that semen actually has antidepressant properties. So women that were having sex without a condom were feeling less symptoms of depression. But since when the time since they had had sex increased, they became more and more depressed. So it showed that there was a correlation between sexual intercourse involving semen and alleviating depression. So what we can learn from this is that sex is something that you learn from experience. There's conditioning and association. So you learn to associate stimuli and outcome. We are really tied into the cost-benefit ratio and the reward system. So in terms of informed citizenship and our life at Lawrenceville, we need to understand that Sex is very natural. We need to understand why we want it. We are wired to do so and what our intentions are. Everybody's different, and that's okay. Same with the multiple intelligences. People have different preferences, and that's just a reflection of their cognitive makeup. And so sex is not necessarily bad. It's not something that needs to be judged, but if we can understand our intentions and understand the motivations behind it, then we're going to be okay. Thank you.